Hi, I'm Charles Strong III of Strong Counseling Solutions LLC. We offer on-site counseling in Gretna, Louisiana, and board-approved online counseling throughout the state of Louisiana. So today we're going to talk about narratives, particularly stories, and their impact on us. Nielsen TV, the ratings folks, a couple years ago identified that the average person spends 34 hours on television per week, which equates to 9 to 12 full years of life spent watching television by the age of 65. Now that's a huge chunk of our time, and that's just one form of media, one form of narrative that's presented to us. Melanie C is a psychologist. You can find her on Twitter at NARRPROF. She talked about the power of narrative to change beliefs. She's edited Narrative Impact and Persuasion, Psychological Insight and Perspectives. And she's talked about a theory, the transportation into narrative worlds, how people get immersed in narratives and how we're influenced by those narratives. She said narratives they get our hooks into us because cognition and emotion are engaged during immersion in narrative, and we take that information and bring it into the real world. We'll talk about that in a second. And this contrast from propaganda and such that lists arguments for buying, voting, and so on, because those depend largely on how much we believe in the substance of that message. She said they diverge because we step into stories instead of stepping back and analyzing that sort of rhetoric. She called it rhetoric versus poetic. She said the stories can change our beliefs about smoking, consumer products, attitudes toward other groups in society, is all by just stepping into another character's shoes, seeing the world from their eyes. So think of how you get immersed in a story, like a scary story in particular. So scary story, mystery novel, something like that, something where suspense is high. You're in the book, you're in the room, and someone comes up and is talking to you. You don't hear him at first. You don't hear them walk up to you, and they put a hand on your shoulder, and you're startled. Because you're envisioning the world, you're sympathizing with that character at the time. You're not in the real world, in a way. And that involvement in stories mentally simulates events in a similar way that we use cognition to remember events in the past and project how future events are going to go. Those are basic survival skills. Think of how many times you've looked back to maybe mistakes you feel you've made in the past to try to change future behavior. Or think of something coming up, an event, a social gathering or something like that, or a job interview, where you're trying to predict different ways it can end up. So that immersion, that involvement in stories, that mentally simulating events using your imagination, is a lot like those survival skills that we use in day-to-day life. Literary scholar Lisa Zunshine says that stories interest us because they allow us to practice theory of mind. And what that means is that we get to utilize social skills without consequence. So we get to imagine ourselves as this character and say, well, I think they're going to do this. I think they're going to react in this way. And if we're right, we're right. That kind of reaffirms what we had in our mind as something we might have done ourselves. And if we're wrong, we're just wrong. There's no consequence. There's nothing bad that happens to us just from incorrectly predicting how a character was going to respond to a situation. Melanie talked about counter-arguing and how it's reduced in narrative. So that propaganda approach before, we typically respond negatively, like don't preach at me, don't come at me with that sort of thing. But with narrative, we typically respond to, I wonder what's going to happen to this character, or something a little more positive. We're more receptive. She says that entertainment and cognitive engagement reduce our tendency to argue against points. Now that's a huge boon for these stories and these narratives to influence us, right? She says that a storyteller's talent improves perceptions that they're warm and friendly, which you might note from one of my earlier videos, being equated with charisma, versus competence resulting from presentation of facts. And if they're good at stories, they're seen as leaders or with the capacity to lead. As a closing note, Melanie cited research where participants were told a story, and before the story, they were told that it was false. You know, this someone's made this story up. It's not true. Along those lines. But she found that the point of the story, the kernel, what they were trying to get across, knowing that it was false ahead of time did not significantly reduce the impact on the participants of the narrative. So I think that says a lot about how the presentation of a message, how we frame it, how we put it out to the world, you know, how it hits us from the very beginning determines how it's going to be received. And narrative stories, just we're much more prone to open our minds to those, and in that way we're a bit more influenced. So that was just this week's video. Join us next week for our next video. We're going to be covering all kinds of different topics. So hope you found it interesting, and I hope you join me next week. Thanks. Be well.